قال المصنف رحمه الله, said the author, may Allah have mercy upon him. وأي موضع صلى في المسجد بصلاة الإمام فيه, and any spot in which one prayed inside the masjid by the Imam's prayer, meaning following the Imam, وهو عالم بصلاته, and he knows the Imam's prayer, يعني he knows what position the Imam is in, أجزأه, then this is sufficient for the follower. ما لم يتقدم عليه, as long as he's not in front of the Imam, and also he doesn't start his prayer before the Imam. الشرح, the explanation. اعلم أن لصحة الاقتداء شروطا, know that for the validity of following an Imam there are conditions. أحدها العلم بصلاة الإمام, one of them is being knowledgeable about the Imam's prayer. أي العلم بأفعاله الظاهرة, meaning being knowledgeable, yani knowing his apparent position. وهذا لا بد منه, this is unavoidable. ونص عليه الشافعي, Imam al-Shafi'i documented that case. واتفق عليه الأصحاب, and the mujtahids within the Shafi'i school agree about it, that you have to know the Imam's position in the prayer. ثم العلم قد يكون بمشاهدة الإمام, and knowing about the Imam's position could be by witnessing the Imam. أو مشاهدة بعض الصفوف, or by witnessing some of the lines that follow the Imam. وقد يكون بسماع صوت الإمام, or it could be by hearing the Imam's voice. أو بسماع صوت المبلغ, or by hearing the voice of who conveys the moves of the Imam. Even if the one who's conveying the Imam's moves is not praying, like if someone were standing on the side for some reason not praying, and then when the Imam moves he says Allahu Akbar, Sami'a Allahu liman hamidah, Rabbana lakal hamd, Allahu Akbar. So you know the Imam's moves by this conveyor. It's valid for you to follow the Imam like that. Ash-sharatu thani, the second condition, ألا يتقدم المأموم على الإمام, is for the follower not to be ahead of the Imam. في الموقف, in the standing position. لأن المقتدين بالنبي صلى الله عليه وسلم رضي الله عنهم أجمعين لم ينقل عنهم التقدم عليه, because it was never reported about anyone who followed the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam that he stood ahead of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wa ala alihi wasallam. وكذا المقتدون بالخلفاء الراشدين, and likewise those who followed the guided caliphs in the prayer. لم ينقل عن أحد منهم ذلك, it was never reported about any of them that they stood ahead of the Imam. فلو تقدم المأموم على الإمام بطلت صلاته على الجديد. And so, if the follower steps in front of the Imam, his prayer is invalidated according to the new school of Ash-Shafi'i. The old school, though, has details, so you need to be careful. This includes also if the Imam steps behind the follower. What if the Imam steps behind the follower? This will invalidate the follower's prayer. because he cannot be ahead of the Imam. So sometimes when some Imams stand up, or even when they go down, they might uh, move their feet, yani, back up, that is, when standing up or going down. So be careful there. And as you know, the consideration is by the heel, the heel. So if the Imam's heel winds up behind the follower's heel, this will invalidate the prayer of the follower. So, ولو تقدم عليه في أثناء صلاته بطلت أيضا لوجود المخالفة. Yani, I basically already said that. If this happens in the prayer, within the prayer, then the prayers of the follower, the prayer of the follower is invalidated. ولا تضر مساواته لإمامه. And to be standing equally, if his heel is exactly parallel to the Imam's heel, not in front nor behind, then this does not invalidate the prayer. That's disliked though. ويندب تخلفه عن إمامه قليلا. It is recommended for the follower to be behind his Imam a little bit. ثم الاعتبار في التقدم بالعقب. Furthermore, as we just said, the regard when it comes to being in front is by the heel. وهو مؤخر الرجل. That's the end, the back end of the foot. ومحل ذلك في القيام. And that's relevant in the standing position. فإن كان قاعدا فالاعتبار بالألية. But in the sitting position, the regard is given to the buttocks, the cheeks of the buttocks. وإن صلى مضطجعا فالاعتبار بالجنب. And if a person prayed laying on his side, then the regard is by the side. إذا عرفت هذا فللإمام والمأموم ثلاثة أحوال. So if you know that, then know that the Imam and the Ma'moom, the Imam, the leader of the prayer, and the Ma'moom, the follower of the prayer, have three cases. أحدها أن يكون خارج المسجد. One case is that both of them are outside of the masjid. Not talk about musalla here. So if they're both in the musalla, that means they're both outside of the masjid. والثانية أن يكون الإمام داخل المسجد والمأموم خارجه. The second case is that the Imam is inside the masjid and the follower is outside the masjid. That shouldn't be hard for you to conceive. Like if you're in a Muslim country, so everybody is Muslim or most of the people are Muslims, and it's Jumu'ah, and the masjid is full to capacity, and then there's still people outside, or Eid prayer, maybe even more people there. So the Imam is in the masjid and the followers outside the masjid. SubhanAllah, when I was in Lebanon, the women don't even go to their Eid prayer. There's no space. So here in our, in some countries, I don't know where all of you are, but like in America here, for example. So yeah, the sisters go to their Eid prayer because there's plenty of space still. It's a little bit tighter though, but still. But there's no space at all. So I asked, what do the sisters do? They said they are getting the food ready. because it's Eid, so they're gonna eat nice meal and everything. وهذه تأتي في كلام الشيخ. This second case is gonna come in what the author has to say. Imam Abu Shuja' rahimahullah. والحالة الثالثة أن يكون الإمام والمأموم في المسجد. And the third case is that both the Imam and the Ma'mum are in the masjid. وهي التي ذكرها الشيخ بقوله. And that's the case that the author mentioned, the Shaykh Abu Shuja', that he mentioned when he said, وأي موضع صلى في المسجد بصلاة الإمام فيه جاز. يعني أجزأه. Yeah. That's what the author was talking about when he said, any spot in the masjid that the follower prays following the Imam, jaza, that's permissible, that's valid. وذكر الشرطين اللذين ذكرناهما بقوله. And he mentioned, Abu Shuja', he mentioned the two conditions that we've already mentioned. وهو عالم بصلاته. While he knows the Imam's prayer, he knows what position the Imam is in. أجزأه. This will be sufficient for the follower. ما لم يتقدم عليه. As long as he's not standing in front of the Imam. Or as long as he's not in front of the Imam. فإذا جمعهما مسجد أو جامع صح الاقتداء. So if they are both in a masjid or a jami', it's valid for the follower to follow the Imam. سواء انقطعت الصفوف بينهما أو اتصلت. Whether the lines between the Imam and the follower are connected or broken. It means we're saying is if you follow the Imam in the masjid, doesn't matter where you are, as long as you're not in front of him. وَسَوَاءٌ حَالَ بَيْنَهُمَا حَائِلٌ أَمْ لَا. And whether there's a barrier between the Imam and the Ma'mum or not in a masjid. وَسَوَاءٌ جَمَعَهُمَا مَكَانٌ وَاحِدٌ أَمْ لَا. And whether they were in the same place in the masjid or not. In the masjid, it's valid. And you might be wondering, what's a jamia? Inside a masjid or a jamia? What's that? The jamia is the main masjid where the Jumu'ah is done. The idea being, traditionally and ideally, all the Muslims should be on the same thing, right? There shouldn't be any difference amongst us. So, then there should be one Jumu'ah in every town. You learned about that before when we learned about Jumu'ah. There should be one Jumu'ah in the town. So then that masjid for the Jumu'ah should be the biggest one, because that's the one where everybody's going to go to in the town for Jumu'ah. So that one, that's the one that's called Al-Jami'. So the Jami' is the masjid where the Jumu'ah would be held. And there could be other masjids in the town that don't hold Jumu'ah. قال المصنف رحمه الله, said the author, may Allah have mercy upon him, وإن صلى الإمام في المسجد والمأموم خارج المسجد قريبا منه. If the Imam prays inside the masjid and the follower prays outside the masjid, close to it, وهو عالم بصلاته, and he knows about the Imam's prayer, what position he's in, ولا حائل هناك, and there's no barrier there, jaz, that's permissible, meaning it's valid. The meaning of a barrier is something that's normally used to be a partition between two different places. and it blocks the follower from passage had he wanted to pass, or blocks the follower from seeing, like if the door of the masjid were closed, even if it were cracked, that's enough to invalidate the follower's prayer. Because if the door is cracked, that will block the follower from being able to see the imam. But water is not usually a barrier. It's not usually a partition between two places. And fire is not usually a partition between two places. So for water to be there or fire to be there, that doesn't prevent a valid following of the imam. الشرح الحالة الثانية إذا كان الإمام في المسجد والمأموم خارج المسجد. The explanation is that here we're going to refer back to the second case. The imam is in the masjid and the follower is outside of it. وَلَيْسَ بَيْنَهُمَا حَائِلٌ, and there is no partition between them. صَحَّ الِاقْتِدَاء, then following the imam in this case is valid. إِذَا لَمْ يَزِدِ الْمَسَافَةُ عَلَى 300 ذِرَاعٍ, as long as the distance between the imam and no, as long وتعتبر المسافة من آخر المسجد على الأصح, as long as the distance between the masjid and the follower were not more than 300 cubits. So the imam is inside the masjid, the follower is outside the masjid, and there's no partition, there's no barrier, like the door of the masjid is open. This is valid as long as there's not more than 300 cubits between the masjid and the follower, not the imam and the follower, the masjid and the follower, because the imam is in the masjid. So now that whole masjid is going to be like the imam, and the follower can't be more than 300 cubits from the masjid. الحالة الثالثة أن يكون الإمام والمأموم في غير المسجد. The third case was for the imam and the follower to be outside of the masjid. فتارة يكونان في فضاء وتارة يكونان في غير فضاء. So in this case, sometimes they would be outside in the open, and sometimes they're not outside in the open, meaning they would be in a building somewhere, in some building. الضرب الأول أن يكون في فضاء. So the first case is that they're out in the open, both of them. فيجوز الاقتداء بشرط ألا يزيد ما بينهما على 300 ذراع. So then تقريبا في الأصح. So then it's valid to follow the imam as long as there's not more than approximately 300 cubits, according to what's most accurate. فلو تلاحقت الصفوف فيعتبر ألا يكون بين المأموم والصف الأخير زيادة على 300 ذراع. If there were lines behind the imam, then there cannot be more than 300 cubits between the follower and the last line. ولو حال بين الإمام والمأموم أو بين الصفين نهر يمكن العبور فيه بلا سباحة. Now, if there were a river between the imam and the ma'mum, or between two lines, there's a river. يمكن العبور فيه, a river that's crossable. بلا سباحة, without swimming. This river is crossable without swimming. Like it's a stream, for example, or small river, a creek. It's like a creek, for example. It's crossable by jumping. I'm not saying you're going to jump in your prayer. We're just talking about it's crossable. It's crossable by jumping, imma bil wuthubi or bil khawdi, or it's crossable by just going into it and then crossing through it. أو العبور على الجسر, or it's crossable because there's a bridge. صح الاقتداء, then it's valid to follow the Imam when there's not more than 300 cubits between them. وكذا إن كان يحتاج إلى سباحة على الصحيح. And according to what's correct, even if it does require swimming, you can still follow the Imam according to what's correct. وكذا الشارع المطروق, and likewise a street, a road, yani, a road or a street, a pathway that people walk. So there's an Imam, and then there's a path, and people walk there and going back and forth there, and then you're following the Imam with this road between the two of you. It's still valid as long as there's not more than 300 cubits. Wallahu a'lam, and Allah knows best about that. وَالضَّرْبُ الثَّانِي أَنْ يَكُونَ فِي غَيْرِ فَضَاءٍ. And the third case is that they are not out in the open. Neither of them are out in the open. كما إذا وقف الإمام في صحن دار. Like if the Imam is standing in the living room. والمأموم على ضفة منها, and the followers on the balcony. أو في بيت آخر منها, or the followers in another house. أو كان في مدرسة أو رباط, or the Imam and the follower are in a school or a hotel. مشتمل على بيوت, يعني a place that has several houses. Like, what do you call that? A villa? وأروقة على بيوت وأروقة, or it has corridors. ووقف الإمام في الرواق أو في محراب الرواق. And so the Imam, he stood in one corridor, or he stood يعني at a mihrab in a corridor. وصف خلفه في الرواق المأمومين, and then there were followers behind him in the corridor. فإن كان موقف المأموم في بيت أو رواق آخر عن يمين الإمام أو عن يساره أو خلفه, then if where the follower is standing is in another house or another corridor on the right of the Imam or the left of the Imam, أو خلفه, or behind the Imam, ففي كيفية الاقتداء طريقان, then there's two ways to follow the Imam. صحح النووي منهما أن المعتبر القرب والبعد المذكور في الفضاء. Imam an-Nawawi deems correct that it's just like being out in the open, the same as far as being not more than 300 cubits away from the Imam. And you can't have a partition between you and the Imam. So, for example, in the Musalla, there's a door on, let's say, the left of the Imam, and then that door leads to a whole nother room. So there's a line goes behind the Imam, then goes in through that door, and then there's people behind in that room. All that's valid as long as they're connected to the Imam and they have the open door, and there's not more than 300 cubits between them and the Imam. ثم هذا كله إذا لم يكن حائل أصلا. And all of this is if there is no partition. أو كان هناك باب نافذ, or there's a door but it's open. فوقف بحذائه رجل أو صف فإنه يصح. And then there was a man standing there or a line there. This is valid. فلو حال حائل يمنع الاستطراق والمشاهدة. But if there were a partition that prevents passage and seeing, أو الاستطراق دون المشاهدة, or even only prevents passage and you can still see, كالشباك, like there's a window there, لم يصح الاقتداء, then It's not valid to follow the Imam this way. Wallahu a'lam, and Allah knows best.